They killed my team, Sarah Kane screamed in the grip of a nightmare, sweat soaking her skin. The former Navy SEAL snapped awake, clutching the Barrett.50 that lay beside her bed. It wasn't just a rifle, but the last fragment of memory from Task Force Phantom, the non-existent unit she once served with. On its cold steel frame, the faintly carved letters still haunted her every night. For a decade, Sarah lived like a shadow until the day a mysterious agent appeared, placing a dossier in front of her. He asked, "What really happened with Phantom? If you walk away from this story now, you'll miss the most shocking confession ever from a unit that was never supposed to exist." The dark garage echoed only with the steady drip of water falling onto the stained cement floor. On a worn wooden table lay oil-soaked rags mottled with dark patches, beside a neat row of old cartridges lined up like metallic tombstones. Sarah Kane sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the Barrett.50 resting before her. The rifle was long, cold, heavy, just like the memories she had spent a decade trying to bury. Dim light swept across the scratched steel surface, revealing 3 faint letters, TF. P. Phantom. They were like scars carved into flesh, never to heal. Sarah raised her hand, running her finger gently along the engraving. Gun oil clung to her skin, icy to the touch, yet deep in her palm it burned hot, as if the blood of her teammates still seeped from years past. The garage door swung open. Texas night air rushed in, carrying the scent of smoke, dust, and dampness. A tall, lean figure stepped inside, his gray suit pressed sharp, almost absurdly out of place in the worn, grimy setting. He placed a thin dossier on the table with deliberate weight. It slid across the wood and came to rest before the barrel of the Barrett, like a challenge. When Sarah opened it, the first page was an old photograph, her clad in desert camouflage, Barrett slung over her shoulder, the Phantom engraving faintly visible on the stock. The image struck like a slap to the mind. She had believed every trace had been erased from reports, journals, even from the memories of those who once stood beside her. And yet, somehow, someone had kept a fragment of the truth. The man needed no introduction, no persuasion. The way he laid down the file, the cold certainty in his eyes, said everything. He hadn't come here by chance. He didn't have to shout, didn't have to accuse. He simply left silence enough for Sarah to hear her own heartbeat pounding like war drums inside the narrow garage. In that silence, Sarah's hand tightened around the rifle's grip. Her gaze was sharp, but beneath it brewed a storm long restrained. She had left it all behind: comrades, glory, even the very name Phantom. But the appearance of that photo was like someone prying open a coffin, exposing what was meant to sleep. Memories flooded back uninvited. A night in Pakistan, moonless, the wind shrieking through the mountains. The radio crackled, then the order, retreat. It rang like thunder, splitting her skull. Sarah remembered screaming, but the gunfire drowned everything. The team was surrounded, bullets rained like fire. She saw a teammate fall, eyes still open, still smiling. She saw herself crawling through a pool of blood, clawing toward escape in the chaos. Then, silence. Only her. A bead of cold sweat dropped onto the back of her hand, mixing with gun oil. Sarah inhaled sharply, forcing herself back to the present. Across from her, the man sat with probing eyes that seemed to pierce through, as if he too was watching that blood-soaked battle through her gaze. He asked little. Only one dry, cutting sentence echoed through the garage like a verdict. "Why is a weapon issued only to Phantom in your hands?" No more words were needed. Sarah understood. This wasn't about a rifle, nor about a faint engraving. It was about existence, or non-existence, of a unit the Pentagon had tried to bury. Her eyes stayed on the photo. In her head, 1,000 questions screamed. How did he know? Who had kept this file? And most of all, if everything had been erased, why was the name Phantom now knocking on her door? The cramped room seemed to shrink, pressing in heavy. The old ceiling fan creaked, joining the tick of the clock, stretching the moment of confrontation into a frozen tableau. Sarah knew that from the instant that photograph surfaced, she was no longer just a nameless veteran in a dusty garage. She had been summoned back to the battlefield, not one of sand and bullets, but of secrets and hidden hands. And in that moment, as her eyes locked with his, Sarah wondered, was this the beginning of the truth being unearthed, or merely the opening move of a new hunt with her as the prey? A business card slid lightly across the wooden table, stopping right under the sickly yellow glow of a fluorescent bulb. The embossed letters stood out clear. Special Agent Robert Hayes, Defense Intelligence Agency. In the old garage, heavy with oil and dust, that stiff piece of paper felt like a small crack in a thick wall of silence, warning of an earthquake about to break. Hayes did not rush. He lowered himself into the metal chair opposite, adjusting his glasses as though the grimy air of this place didn't bother him in the least. That unhurried gesture, to Sarah's eyes, carried the weight of someone long accustomed to placing the lives of others on the scale. He exhaled not the weary sigh of a bureaucrat, but the breath of a man so burdened with secrets that each time he revealed a sliver, it was like pulling the oxygen out of the room. The Barrett .50 still lay there, dominating the table like a silent witness. Hayes tilted his head toward it, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Then he spoke, low and steady, his voice more verdict than statement. Sarah wasn't the only one who had survived Phantom, but she was the only one they had found. And that Barrett it had never been issued to anyone outside Phantom's sniper team. Sarah sat rigid, her back straight as if strapped to the chair. The words hit like a muffled shot, shattering the last walls she had built over 10 long years. Every brick of memory she had stacked to keep the past at bay cracked and fell. Hayes opened the file, each movement deliberate, almost cruel. Inside were old photographs, paper yellowed and fragile, as if dragged from some archive buried deep underground. Phantom 7 figures stood amid dust and shadow. Every face had been blacked out with ink, every face but one. One pair of eyes remained intact, Sarah's. Those eyes, staring back at her from the photo, were not the eyes of a retired woman living hidden away in Texas. They were the eyes of a sniper, of someone who knew that each time she peered through a scope, she stared into death, her target's peace, and possibly her own. The air tightened, drawn taut like a guitar string ready to snap. Hayes closed the file, the dry thud of cardboard against wood echoing like the cut of a blade. His voice shed any softness, turning sharp and cold. Task Force Phantom had never existed, but if the truth were exposed, there were men in government who would lose everything. In that instant, Sarah understood. For years she had believed her pain was hers alone, a scar no one could see, no one would believe. But now, it was not a faded memory, not a ghost she kept locked away. It was a double-edged blade, suspended above many heads, and her very existence, however quiet, was enough to let it fall. The garage suddenly felt too small. The ticking of the clock cut through the stillness, mingling with the whistle of wind through the doorframe. Sarah's eyes fell to the Barrett, remembering every night she had cleaned it, clinging to the ritual as proof that the past had closed. Yet now she saw it plainly. The rifle had never been the past. It was living evidence, a key to the door sealed behind thousands of layers of secrecy. She leaned back, gaze still locked on the file. Each photo, each scrap of paper, was an invisible hand dragging her back to that night in Pakistan. That night, Phantom dissolved not because the enemy was stronger, but because of a senseless order to retreat. She remembered the chill racing her spine, remembered the muffled cries of teammates drowned in smoke and dust. Hayes watched her in silence, as though knowing persuasion was useless. He didn't need her belief. He had just handed her the one thing no veteran could deny: acknowledgement from authority. And that acknowledgement was the breaking point. It transformed what Sarah had kept buried in her heart into a reality she could no longer reject. A small part of her wanted to laugh at the irony. For 10 years she had struggled to convince herself Phantom was real, that her pain wasn't imagined. And now, with a DIA agent confirming it, she felt like a bird pulled out of a dark cage, realizing the open sky above was full of traps. There was nothing sweet in that confirmation, only the weight of a warning. And to Sarah it rang as clear as a siren on a battlefield. From now on, every step she took would be watched. But there was something else. If Hayes spoke the truth, if she wasn't the only one, then which teammate had survived, and why had only she been found? The question hung sharp in her mind like a gleaming blade, twisting deeper, forcing her to face the inevitable. Would the secret still hidden in the dark save her or bury her once again? Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. The wind that howled through the Hindu Kush carried with it the frozen breath of death. That night, the sky was pitch black, thick as spilled ink, with only a faint crescent moon clinging to the jagged cliffs. The valley lay in silence so still that Sarah Kane could hear the thud of her own heartbeat beneath her armor, beating in rhythm with the steady breaths of the 6 teammates at her back. Task Force Phantom was born in darkness and lived only in darkness. No flag, no uniform, no trace on paper. They existed like the cold breath of night, their only mission to hunt the targets the government would never admit were on any list. In their world, honor came not from medals, but from never being spoken of. Sarah was only 28 at the time, too young perhaps to carry a 30-pound Barrett on her shoulders for miles, but old enough to know she had stepped into a world with no way out. She was one of the very few women who had made it through the brutal selection. Her skill with the Barrett.50 exceeded SOCOM standards so thoroughly that one instructor had once half-joked, "If the devil himself shows up on the horizon, just put Sarah on the rooftop, she'll send him back to hell with a single shot." Her teammates called her the guardian angel, the angel of protection with steel eyes behind the scope. The mission that day had seemed textbook. Surround a hidden compound where a high-value Al-Qaeda target was holed up. Phantom moved in silence, their bodies blending into dust and shadow. Sarah took the high ground, prone behind her scope, watching the camp from afar. Her heart beat its familiar rhythm, tense, focused, yet oddly calm, as if the whole world had shrunk down to her crosshairs. Then the order came. The commander's voice crackled through the radio, dry and blunt. Retreat. Abort the target. At first, Sarah thought she had misheard. The enemy was only a few hundred meters away, the perimeter sealed tight. She had already locked the target, her finger ready on the trigger. But instead of fire, they were told to pull back. That moment of hesitation was enough to turn night into hell. Bullets tore through the air, screaming like fireworks of death. Grenades exploded in sand, rocks and dirt pelting her face. Phantom was swallowed whole by fire. Sarah remembered it with brutal clarity. Corporal Jason Reed, the team's scout, falling right in front of her. Eyes still open, still shining with a fragile trust. Blood spread across his chest faster than she could press her hands to stop it. She tried to drag him back, but the torrent of gunfire hammered down like a storm of steel, forcing her into the rocks. A shard of shrapnel ripped through her shoulder, pain so sharp she thought her bone had shattered. Her body felt like lead, but instinct drove her forward. She crawled past her fallen comrades, through the stench of gunpowder, blood, and wet earth thick enough to twist her gut. Every movement was a bargain with death. Through the radio, familiar voices vanished one by one, screams, names shouted into chaos, then silence. When the last signal cut out, Sarah realized she was the only fragment left in the firestorm. By morning, the sun rose over the valley. Sarah opened her eyes to find her knees stiff in a crust of dried blood. There was no one left. No reinforcements, no helicopters, no rescue signal. Only stone, sand, and lifeless arms stretched across the ground. She dragged herself for 4 days through ravines, across shifting sands, living on rainwater and scraps of rations. Each night she thought it would be her last. Each morning somehow she woke again. At one point, delirious with fever, she even laughed at herself. Maybe the devil just fell asleep and forgot to take me. When she finally staggered back to base, her clothes in tatters, her body more ghost than flesh, she wasn't met with the embrace of comrades. Instead, she saw the cold stare of the duty officer. The report read, "Task Force Phantom does not exist. Every file erased. No record of the mission, no names of her team, not even proof she had been there." The deepest wound wasn't in her body. It was the absolute denial. She had lost her team, her family, and now she had lost even the proof they had ever lived. A soldier's entire life snapped in silence. From that moment on, Sarah knew she was no longer a warrior in uniform. She was only a shadow, carrying memories no one acknowledged, surviving when no one wanted her to. Phantom, the unit that had been her faith and honor, was now nothing more than a faint engraving on the side of a barret. And yet, even under forced oblivion, Sarah carried one question that haunted her every night. That order to retreat, was it truly a mistake, or a trap laid to wipe out the entire team? The Texas night was so quiet that even the sound of insects seemed to echo from another world. Sarah Kane thought she had grown used to that silence after 10 years in hiding. But that evening, the pale blue glow of her laptop screen lit her face inside the garage, exposing lines etched deeper than all her years in uniform. She had only meant to check an old mechanics forum, where gearheads traded tricks on resurrecting rusted engines. But then a strange link appeared in her anonymous inbox. A single, unconscious click dragged her into a black hole from which light no longer found an easy way out. On the screen appeared a leaked document from the dark web. The title was written in a cold, blunt font, "Purge Target List." Sarah's heart pounded like a hammer. She scrolled, eyes locked on every line. Names she didn't know, some she had vaguely heard during her service years. And then, her pulse froze when she saw the familiar one, Sarah Kane. Her photo appeared, not an old military shot, but a recent image, pulled straight from her Texas driver's license. A bright red circle enclosed her face, with a short note, "Traitor, must be eliminated." The garage, already cramped, seemed to close in, the concrete walls pressing against her chest. Sarah pushed her chair back, her hand instinctively reaching for the Barrett, survival reflex. She had been hunted before in battlefields, but never imagined that even after walking away, she was still squarely in the crosshairs. The sensation of being exposed slammed into her mind. No place safe enough, no false identity thick enough to hide behind. Someone, somewhere, had been watching her for years, waiting for the moment to drag her name back into the light. That night, as Sarah forced herself to lie down, a faint sound stirred outside the garage. Metal scraped lightly, barely a whisper, but enough to jolt her upright. The window was cracked, the darkness beyond devouring every detail. Her hand stretched, the Barrett already loaded. Her movements were quick, precise muscle memory that had never abandoned her. The scope swept the night, searching for motion. For an instant, she caught a shadow sliding past the tree line, swift and silent, moving the way she once had during Black Ops missions. She snapped on her tactical flashlight, slicing the dark with a harsh beam. The light revealed only bare earth, an empty patch of ground, with a single spent casing and deep boot prints pressed into damp soil. The message was unmistakable. "We know where you are. We can get in any time, and we'll be back." Sarah lowered the Barrett, but her chest still pounded like she was mid-mission. Sweat dripped down her temple, tracing her cheek before breaking against her jaw. Her mind reeled with questions. Who was behind the list? Why now? And most of all, why erase her after all these years? In the side mirror of the old pickup parked outside, she caught her reflection, a middle-aged woman with hollow eyes clutching the Barrett as if it were the last reason she still breathed. She gave herself a bitter smile, half weary, half mocking. Phantom never existed, huh? Then why the hell are they still hunting its ghost? The night dragged heavy, but Sarah knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a warning. This was the opening shot of a hunt. Whoever sent that signal didn't care that she had vanished for 10 years, didn't care that she tried to become no one. To them, Sarah was not a washed-up mechanic in Texas. She was the last living witness of Task Force Phantom, and that made her a target marked for elimination. By dawn, the garage still reeked of gun oil and powder. Sarah sat in silence, staring at the crack of light spilling through the door. She knew now. The ghosts of Pakistan had never slept. And tonight, they had returned not as memories, but as predators of flesh and bone. Only one question remained, burning sharper than all the rest. Would she keep running, or return to what Phantom had been born to do, stand and fight? The smell of roasted coffee filled the air, rich and sharp, mingling with the sweetness of pastries and the grinding whir of a machine. It seemed like just another morning in the Texas suburbs, where people came only to start their day with a cappuccino and a few casual words. But in the corner of the small cafe, by a fogged-up window, a meeting was taking place, a meeting Sarah Kane had never imagined would come. She sat still, her back pressed against the wooden chair, eyes fixed on the empty parking lot outside. Her hand clutched the coffee cup so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The image of the spent casing from last night, the boot prints fading into the darkness, still haunted her, clinging to her like a shadow that refused to be shaken. When the cafe door creaked open, the chime ringing above, Sarah didn't need to look. She knew. Hayes had arrived. But he wasn't alone. A younger man in a dark blue suit followed. His stride was quick, his eyes scanning every exit, every customer, as though memorizing potential threats. That kind of movement could only belong to someone who lived in a world where danger lurked in every corner, an FBI agent. An envelope was placed on the table, thin yet crushing, pressing against her chest like a slab of stone. Sarah opened it. Satellite images unfolded, red marks pinpointing hidden locations across the Middle East. A map lined with complex connections, like a spiderweb spun by invisible hands. And at last, printed emails, fragments of words, but when pieced together, they formed a grim picture. A defense contractor. Backroom deals. Massive payments hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic language. All of it led to one chilling conclusion. The Phantom Massacre in 2012 was no mistake. It was a move in a game that had been rigged from the start. Sarah felt sweat slick her palms. She reread each line, every sentence a bullet driven into her chest. For years she had asked herself whether that retreat order had been a tactical blunder or something darker. Now the answer stared back at her. Phantom had been sacrificed. Her teammates had died for lucrative contracts, for someone in power to climb another rung up the ladder. A bitter rage swelled, followed quickly by a heavy emptiness. Sarah had survived, but survived for what? For 10 years she had been nothing but a shadow, buried in machines, an exile in her own country. And now, all that loss was revealed to be a mere fragment of a power play by men who had never set foot on a battlefield. The FBI agent sat quietly, sparing his words. His eyes, steady and unyielding, carried a message without speaking. She was the only piece left that could flip the board. Hayes leaned back, his worn face drawn even heavier. For a moment, the three of them sat in silence, the clink of spoons against cups from other patrons ringing as clear as gunfire. Sarah clenched her fists. Images from Pakistan surged back, Jason Reed collapsing, eyes still trusting, the voices of her teammates vanishing into static on the radio. They had trusted her, believed she would protect them, that if anyone survived, at least one person would tell their story. Instead, she had stayed silent for a decade, letting their memories be erased from every record. Now, that old guilt burned into fire. This wasn't just an opportunity, this was the last chance for redemption. If she refused, Phantom would forever remain a name that never existed, and her teammates' deaths would dissolve into dust. She exhaled, leaning back, eyes drifting across the cafe. People laughed, sipped their drinks, carried on unaware that at this small table the truth had the power to shake the tallest buildings in Washington. For a fleeting second, Sarah thought how strange it was that the justice of such a powerful nation could begin with a thin paper envelope in a suburban coffee shop. A faint smile flickered on her lips, touched with bitterness, touched with irony. Perhaps Phantom wasn't dead, not in military files, but alive in her heart, in the fire that had smoldered and now blazed again. When she folded the envelope closed, Sarah knew she had crossed a threshold. Once again she was a warrior, not fighting for faceless orders from above, but to claim justice for those who had fallen. But even then, one thought struck her, cold as night air. If they knew she had agreed, would she have enough time to fulfill that promise? Or would she become the very first target in this new game? The heavy metal door screeched open, its cold echo spreading through the hollow emptiness of an abandoned freezer warehouse. A burst of icy air rushed out, wrapping around Sarah Kane like an invisible hand. She stepped inside, her boots clanging against the concrete floor glazed with a thin layer of frost. Each step reminded her this wasn't a dream, but a real meeting, the one the FBI had arranged, without telling her what waited on the other side. For a moment, Sarah felt something unsettlingly familiar. The skin-splitting cold, the metallic tang in the air, the suffocating sense of anticipation. It all dragged her back to that fateful night in Pakistan. Her heartbeat quickened, part memory, part fear that behind this door might not be answers, but a trap. And then the figure appeared. Out of the shadows, a man stepped forward, gaunt, hair streaked with gray, eyes hardened like someone who had walked through hell and come back. Sarah froze. Her chest jolted, as if someone had fired a Barrett round right beside her ear. Standing before her was Corporal Jason Reed, the phantom scout she had seen fall in the 2012 ambush. For seconds, Sarah thought she was hallucinating. Jason's blood-soaked body, eyes wide open, had haunted her every night for a decade. But now, Jason stood there, trembling, real enough that she could hear the ragged wheeze of his breath. He didn't speak at first. Slowly, he held out a silver hard drive, its scratched casing heavy as though dug out of the earth itself. Sarah reached for it, her hand shaking uncontrollably. Inside that drive, Jason gave a faint nod, was the truth. Contracts, documents, emails, dry lines of text, yet powerful enough to set Washington ablaze. Phantom hadn't been killed by enemy fire. Phantom had been sold out. Someone had taken money from a weapons conglomerate in exchange for the lives of 7 men and women. Heat rushed to Sarah's face. A decade of buried pain erupted, boiling into a fury she could barely contain. Every question she had carried for 10 years, the retreat order, the vanishing from records, now answered, and the answer was more poisonous than any wound. Phantom hadn't died to war. Phantom had died to betrayal, Americans betrayed by Americans. Jason slumped into a broken chair, his eyes staring at some distant emptiness, as if still reliving that night in Pakistan. He had survived, but not to live, only to carry the truth like an anchor around his neck. His words came slow, heavy, each one slicing open the silence. If this truth came into the light, it would burn the Pentagon to its foundations. But if it stayed buried, more phantoms would be sacrificed to feed the game of power. Sarah gripped the drive, the cold biting through her arm. She remembered every face, teammates who laughed with her in tents, shared rations, staked their lives on the aim of her Barrett. Now they existed only in memory and in these files. A part of her wanted to collapse. For years she had tried to forget, to run, and now the truth shoved her back onto the same road. Another part of her wanted to laugh laugh at the cruel irony. Phantom wasn't in the records, but its ghost now had the power to make the mighty tremble. Jason lifted his head, eyes meeting Sarah's mawn. In that gaze was a fragile hope that she wouldn't run this time, that Phantom would live again through the truth. Sarah drew a deep breath. She didn't know where this path would end, or how much time she had before the people behind the kill list came for her. But she knew one thing. The moment she held this drive, she was already at the center of a new war. The cold of the warehouse no longer made her shiver. Fear had given way to resolve. Phantom had once been buried in darkness. But now, perhaps it was the darkness that would learn to tremble before the light of truth. Sarah gave a faint nod, clutching the hard drive tight. And the only question echoing in her mind was, would she have the strength to bring this truth into the light before the system swallowed her whole once again? Late at night, the wind swept through the Texas town as if it meant to erase every trace of the day. The old garage was lit again. The fluorescent tube buzzed, its pale light spilling across the grease and metal dust. On the workbench, the Barrett.50 stretched out, its scarred steel body reflecting each beat of Sarah's heart. She set the silver hard drive down beside the rifle, two heavy, silent objects bound by the same fate. Her fingers traced the faint engraving, TFPHANTM, her hand trembling though her eyes were sharp as a blade. For years she had cleaned the rifle just to forget. But now, every movement was no longer a dull ritual, it was preparation. The worn cloth slid along the barrel, slow, deliberate strokes. The faint smell of gun oil mixed with the tang of rust, pulling her back into memories of countless night watches. Sarah let out a dry, bitter laugh, mocking herself. Maybe this is the longest love I've ever had, a Barrett and the ghosts that refused to sleep. Outside, the world kept spinning, people buying, selling, loving, living, oblivious that in a small garage lay a truth powerful enough to crack the foundations of government. Sarah knew she no longer had the luxury of deciding what to do. The makers of the kill list would not stop, and with Jason alive, with this evidence now in her hands, the truth could no longer be buried. She locked the Barrett's chamber, the metallic click ringing through the space like an iron vow. In that moment, Sarah felt she wasn't just arming a rifle, she was arming her soul. Phantom had never disappeared. It lived on, in blood, in memory, and now, in the fire of justice rising within her. Jason sat quietly behind her. His eyes caught the dim light, lined with hardship yet bright with hope. He had returned from the dead only to pass the torch, and Sarah understood. If she faltered, if she turned away, Phantom would die again, this time, forever. Sarah rose, stepping to the garage door. Beyond it stretched the vast night, silent as a black sea. She drew in a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, reminding her she was still alive, still capable of choosing. If justice won't come from above, the words echoed in her mind like a final command, then we'll have to bring it from below. No speeches, no flags. Sometimes justice began with nothing more than a rifle, a hard drive, and two survivors. The imagined camera lens froze on Sarah's face. Her eyes, steel hard and unflinching, no longer belonged to a woman hiding in a dusty garage. They were the eyes of a warrior, the last soldier of Task Force Phantom, carrying the fire of justice that the entire system longed to extinguish. The garage door shut behind her. The darkness swallowed her silhouette, but not her resolve. A new covert war was beginning not on desert sands, but in the heart of America, where truth and lies tangled like barbed wire. And one final question hung heavy, inescapable. Would Sarah have the strength to set the truth ablaze, or would Phantom's flame once again be smothered by the shadows of power? And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe. This was a setup. Marcus's strangled shout broke through as he realized his team had fallen into a trap. The cartel in New Mexico were not the disorganized criminals they had expected, but disciplined fighters, trained with precision. Within mere minutes, the SEALs were driven into a dead corner. No one was coming to save them. No one could hear their cries. And just as the countdown clock ticked down to their final minutes of survival, an unknown female voice suddenly shattered the silence, opening a path to life that no one had dared imagine. 8 minutes to die. That line had barely faded from the intro screen when the story pulled back, revealing fragments of ordinary life in America, the place where our characters were shaped. Lieutenant Marcus Hale, commander of a SEAL team, had once been a living legend in Afghanistan. In the harshest years of war, his comrades called him the combat machine because he never tired, never retreated, and seemed incapable of fear. In night raids, in split-second assaults where everything was measured in heartbeats, Marcus was always the first to surge forward. Bullets might rip past his shoulder, grenades might detonate at his side, but people always saw him rise again, quietly brushing off the dust, as if it were nothing more than a stumble on an ordinary day. Yet back in America, all the glory seemed folded away, locked in a cabinet no one ever opened. At Coronado, his name rarely appeared in official reports. The feats he had carved out on the battlefield gradually survived only in the whispers of old comrades. Out there, on television, America celebrated polished faces in dress uniforms gleaming with medals, while Marcus, in a crowd, looked like nothing more than a shadow in a worn-out uniform. Someone once told him, "You're like a silenced gun, everyone knows it exists, but nobody pays attention to it anymore." He had laughed, half in jest, half in truth. At least a silenced gun still does its job. In another corner of America, nearly 1,200 miles from Coronado, Eleanor Brooke sat behind a wall of monitors in the signal analysis room at Kirtland, New Mexico. Her entire day revolved around invisible currents, flickering radios, blinking satellite feeds, frequencies most people would never hear. If Marcus was the embodiment of raw strength on the front lines, Eleanor was the emblem of the silent shadows. Her colleagues in the base gave her a nickname, half teasing, half sincere, the Ghost Analyst. Not because she was dangerous, but because she was almost invisible. She rarely left the analysis room, seldom showed up in the mess hall, and nearly no one could remember her face if they happened to cross paths in the hallway. At unit gatherings, when others swapped stories of courage in combat, Eleanor sat quietly at the end of the table, listening to the laughter echo like waves crashing against a distant shore she might never set foot on. And yet for those who truly paid attention, her eyes revealed something different, an unwavering steadiness, as if every number, every invisible signal carried a soul, and she was bound to protect it at all costs. On her desk, Eleanor always kept an old, battered compass. It had once belonged to her father, a U.S. Air Force pilot who never returned from a mission in Iraq. To others, it was just a piece of tarnished metal, scratched and aged. But to Eleanor, it was the only guiding star in a chaotic world. She had a ritual. At the end of every shift, she would gently spin the compass needle, watching it tremble before it settled on north. Sometimes colleagues caught her and teased, checking if the Earth is still spinning on its axis. Eleanor would give a faint smile, her eyes glinting mischievously. Just making sure the planet hasn't tilted off course. That touch of wit lightened the heavy air. But it also revealed something deeper, though labeled a shadow. She never let herself lose clarity or the sliver of humor required to endure. In American society, statues are raised for heroes on the battlefield, but few notice the ones bent over in the shadows, carrying the unseen weight of war. Eleanor was one of them. Just like Marcus, two people who seemed so different yet shared one common fate. Both existed on the margins of headlines and grand broadcasts. One had once blazed brightly in combat but was forgotten upon returning. The other had never been named at all, though she worked each day to keep the world steady on frequencies no one else could hear. The question is, when destiny throws them into the same battle, when only a handful of minutes stand between life and death, what truths will be revealed from these so-called shadows? In the signal analysis room bathed in the faint blue glow of monitors, Eleanor Brooks sat still, like a shadow. In that place, where every sound was nothing but dry beeps and static interference, silence could weigh so heavily it felt suffocating. She was used to it. For Eleanor, it was within that very silence that the most important secrets often appeared. Rumors about Eleanor were scarce, but on a military base where gossip thrived, even the smallest story could be magnified into something mysterious. They said her father had once been a combat pilot in the Air Force, killed in action before she was even 10 years old. His death left in Eleanor not only a void in her family, but also a mark that would forever shape the way she looked at the world. On her desk, she kept a single keepsake, an old compass, its metal edges tarnished, its glass face scratched. It held no material value, yet it was like an invisible thread tying her to the past. Sometimes, in the middle of long, dragging shifts, when radio signals went completely dead, she would turn the needle ever so slightly. It always quivered for a moment before settling north, as if to remind her, even when everything else lost its direction, there was still one true path. Her colleagues found the habit peculiar. They would shake their heads, tossing off a joke. Eleanor, checking if the Earth is still spinning on its axis? She would simply smile faintly, her eyes glimmering with a playful spark, replying with her gaze rather than words. In a place hardened by data and procedures, that sliver of humor was enough for people to remember her if only for a brief second. But then, like a short-lived blip flashing across a radar screen, her presence seemed to vanish once more. Most of the time, Eleanor's name was one rarely spoken. In large meetings, she would sit in the back row, head bent over her notebook, never raising her voice. Yet for anyone perceptive enough, one glance at her eyes fixed on the rows of frequencies revealed something rare. An unyielding steadiness, absolute focus. She did not view radio waves as cold numbers, but as the heartbeats of those out there in the field. In Eleanor's mind, every flicker on the main screen was a human life waiting for guidance. One night, during a late shift, when her teammates were nodding off with stifled yawns, Eleanor sat motionless before the monitors. A young officer walked by, curious about the old compass. He chuckled softly. "Is that just for decoration?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. She turned the needle once, let it spin, then said lightly, "At least, it has never betrayed me." It wasn't exactly a reply, more like a fragment left behind. From that night on, the young officer never joked about it again. In an environment where most people competed to be recognized, Eleanor had no concern for recognition. She had no photo hanging on any honor wall, no story retold at a medal ceremony. The only thing she carried was an unshakable loyalty not to rank or to system, but to the lives of those out there, betting everything on the fragile signals she monitored. That was something few ever noticed. But it was precisely that quietness which defined Eleanor's strength. When the world fell silent, she became the only ear that listened. When every map turned useless, that old compass would still point true north. And when someone's fate hung suspended in the night, Eleanor was the one who knew how to keep the signal from vanishing entirely. A rare friend once teased that Eleanor had a superpower, the ability to make herself invisible until the world truly needed her. Eleanor laughed, but deep inside she knew it wasn't wrong. She had never sought to be seen. She only hoped that when the day finally came, she would be calm enough not to step back. In the base's corridors, teammates could walk right past without realizing she had been there. Yet in a moment of life and death, when the radios suddenly went dead, perhaps it was that very invisibility that would change everything. The last light of day descended over the Sangre de Cristo Valley, stretching streaks of orange-red across the sky like scars torn into the horizon. For many, it was nothing more than an ordinary sunset in the American Southwest. But for Marcus Hale's SEAL team, It felt like the final curtain falling before a bloody play. At first, the mission had been labeled as routine reconnaissance, a small weapons cache, a few scattered cartel squads, and a planned withdrawal within 3 hours. Yet only 10 minutes after setting foot in the valley, Marcus realized he had been deceived. The enemy was not chaotic. They moved with discipline, signaled with hand gestures instead of shouts, and kept their spacing precise, like military units drilled to perfection. These were no ordinary traffickers. This was a carefully orchestrated ambush. Dry, cracking blasts erupted from the ridge. Bullets slammed into the earth, kicking up red dust in violent columns. The SEAL formation immediately dispersed, taking cover behind rocks, eyes scanning frantically for an escape route. But through the haze of gunfire, Marcus saw the grim truth. All 3 exits out of the valley were blocked. Armored pickup trucks loomed in the fading light, like steel traps sprung shut across every path. The radios sputtered with static, then fell silent. Their communications were completely jammed. Digital maps on the chest-mounted screens turned useless, showing nothing but a gray void of death. Tools that once gave them confidence now offered only silence, like the valley itself was swallowing them whole. In the dim twilight, one of the younger soldiers slipped, muttering a quiet curse as he fell. The sound was small, yet oddly humanizing. In the chaos of battle, that stumble was a fleeting reminder. They were still men, not machines. Marcus let out a brief, rasping chuckle, the sound catching in his throat, then gripped his weapon tighter. Ammunition dwindled quickly, every round spent with precise calculation, but the enemy was more numerous, better equipped. From the ridgelines, machine guns thundered down, heavy, deliberate, and unrelenting. Sweat poured beneath their body armor, mixing with dust, streaking faces with smeared lines of grime. A sharp cry escaped as Corporal Gomez took a bullet to the shoulder. Blood soaked through a makeshift bandage. The strained breathing of the wounded thickened the air with dread. The combat medics worked furiously, but even they knew, without a way out, their efforts were nothing but a stopgap before the inevitable. Marcus swept his gaze across the valley, where the sun sank fast behind the peaks. The light weakened, shadows crept in, and with them came the final chance to survive. But in his mind, every possibility slammed shut. No escape, no reinforcements, only time, slipping away in the pounding rhythm of his heart. In that moment, Marcus's memory flashed back to Afghanistan. Once, stranded in the desert without a map, an older soldier had joked, "If you don't know where north is, just walk toward the Sunday. At the very least, it'll take you somewhere new." Back then, the team had laughed hard, turning the line into an inside joke. But now, the memory returned with a bitter sting. This time, no sun was bright enough to lead them home. Gun smoke, red dust, the labored groans of comrades, all of it fused into a scene every soldier dreads, trapped in a sealed valley. Tactics, years of training, all seemed powerless against an enemy plan executed with ruthless precision. Each second dragged by, hope flickering out like embers swept away in the wind. What began as a simple reconnaissance had twisted into a death trap, and in the suffocating silence of the jammed radio, only the pounding of soldiers' hearts remained thudding faster and faster, as if warning them all of the same truth. The end was drawing near. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. In the air, thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, amid pounding heartbeats and the metallic clatter of shell casings striking stone, a radio frequency suddenly crackled to life. The first sound was not the usual static, but a calm, firm female voice so clear it felt as if she were standing right behind them. "Ghost 11, on your 6. Marcus froze. The voice was cold yet oddly reassuring. No one on the team had ever heard that name before. There were no files, no instructions from command, no mention in the mission brief. And yet, almost immediately the voice began issuing orders. Short, precise, unwavering. 3 o'clock. East elevation 120 feet. Left side behind the boulder. A shooter has you in his sights. Move through the northwest pass. There's a way out. Each directive was so accurate, it was staggering. One of the younger SEALs, whose hands had been trembling moments earlier as blood seeped through his bandage, squeezed the trigger on her command, and exactly as she said, an enemy sniper dropped instantly. The tension, strung tight as wire, slackened just slightly. The danger remained. The trap still coiled around them, but at least now they knew. Some invisible set of eyes was watching over them, some mind calculating faster than instinct itself. Marcus glanced at his men. In their eyes flickered both fear and doubt. Trusting a nameless voice, appearing from nowhere, this was gambling their lives on blind faith. Yet with death pressing in and fragile hope the only currency left, they had no choice. They chose to believe. The next bursts of gunfire rang out, no longer wild, chaotic shots, each round now guided by the steady calm flowing through the frequency. A path forward began to open. Then came a strange, almost comic twist. As they crawled through a narrow crevice, one of the larger SEALs slipped, crashing into the dirt with a thud that echoed like a sack of potatoes tumbling off a truck. For the briefest moment, the entire team chuckled an absurd, fleeting laugh in the jaws of hell, like a small aspirin dulling a relentless pain. The female voice on the radio seemed to pause for a beat, then resumed her commands, steady and measured, betraying no emotion. Her composure flowed into them. They moved faster now, tighter, as if an unseen hand were pulling them out of the death trap. Marcus, a commander who had led dozens of battles, had never experienced anything so strange. He didn't know the name, didn't know the face, yet felt an unshakable trust. In those brief minutes, something shifted. The SEALs were no longer alone. Out there, across the invisible layers of frequency, someone was fighting beside them. But in Marcus's mind, questions burned hotter with every step. Who could pierce through the dense wall of signal jamming? Who had the knowledge to pinpoint enemy positions in the dark? And most of all, why choose to call herself Ghost 11? The answers would not come in that night's chaos. Ahead of them, bullets still tore through the air. But now, every step forward was no longer blind. The invisible voice had become their compass, precise, unwavering, and unshakable. Everything that followed unfolded like a chess game in which every piece had already been placed. Guided by the mysterious female voice, each SEAL became a link in a chain of movements so precise it seemed impossible. Marcus swept his eyes east. At that exact moment, the instruction came through his headset. 200 feet, left side. He squeezed the trigger. A spark flared on the ridgeline, and the shadow preparing to target his teammate dropped instantly. Not a second was wasted. The moment that shot ended, the voice returned calm, sharp, resolute. Hold steady, the wind is shifting. The team's sniper adjusted his scope, waited half a beat, and fired. Another gap opened in the tightening noose. So it went, each clipped directive like a lifeline, pulling them step by step out of the valley that had been turning into a grave. In the darkness, they followed a rocky stream. The icy water soaked through their pant legs, mingling with the smell of blood, but to them it was a sign of life. Where water flowed, a way forward remained. Gomez, his shoulder torn by a bullet, was carried on a comrade's back. He muttered curses, half from pain, half to keep himself conscious. Another soldier chuckled. "Keep complaining, Gomez. As long as you're griping, you're not dead yet." The squad broke into rough, ragged laughter, strained but precious, like lighting a small candle in the thickness of night. Every step was a burden. Yet the woman's voice in their radios never faltered. She gave bearings, reported the wind, even told them when to pause for breath. The way she spoke, cold as steel, yet strangely gentle, made disbelief impossible. They scrambled across a rock slide. Suddenly, a torrent of machine gun fire tore open behind them. Dust exploded into clouds. A round slammed into the dirt at Marcus's feet, hurling shards of stone. In the instant that felt like their end, the voice cut through again. Right side, get low. Now. The squad dropped as one, like a wave collapsing. Bullets stitched into the cliff face behind them, leaving streaks of fire in the dark. When the dust settled, they were still alive. One young SEAL whispered between ragged breaths, "She really is a ghost." No one disagreed, because in truth she was. Time shrank into heartbeats. Each minute dragged as heavy as a lifetime. But gradually, they realized the ring of steel around them was thinning. Rifles no longer glared from every angle. Enemy flashlights retreated, dimming in the dark. At last, crawling through the Northwest Pass, they emerged into a wide-open sky. The New Mexico night glittered with stars, so still it almost made them forget they had just escaped hell. In that moment, Marcus felt as if he was breathing for the first time after hours underwater. Then, from far off, a sound rose low, familiar. Whump, whump, whump. The pounding blades of a Black Hawk helicopter slicing through the night. They looked at one another, hardly daring to believe. One muttered, "If this is a dream, don't wake me up." The Black Hawk swept in, its white beam cutting across the valley. The team waved signals, hauling one another toward the light. When the bay door opened, a rush of wind slammed their faces, but no one complained. It was the wind of life itself. When the last heavy body was dragged aboard, they all collapsed, drenched in sweat and blood, clinging to their armor. No words were spoken, none were needed. The truth was undeniable. They were alive. Marcus turned to the open hatch. The Sangre de Cristo Valley lay in darkness below, punctuated only by faint red sparks of tracer fire. He knew, without that mysterious female voice, they would have been left there forever, just names crossed out in a sterile report. The SEALs had always been taught that trust is not in the manual, yet that night it was trust in an unseen voice that brought them home. Back at Kirtland Base, the helicopter door had barely shut when silence filled the cabin. The soldiers who had just escaped death sat wordless, each of them aware they had narrowly evaded an inevitable end. But once their boots hit the landing pad, that raw awareness was quickly replaced by something else. Paperwork, procedures, reports. The official report was brutally brief, cold in its detachment. SEAL team escaped encirclement, no fatalities. A sterile line, no different from a maintenance log. No mention of the gunfire that pinned them down, no note of the mysterious guidance, and certainly no reference to the name Ghost 11. To those behind desks, that harrowing ordeal was nothing more than a dot on the mission map. But in the hallways, in the break rooms, and across online forums for veterans, the story spread along another path. The whispers said, "A woman's voice saved the whole team." And from somewhere, somehow, the nickname emerged, the 11th Ghost. In the mess hall, young soldiers retold it with shining eyes, as if they had glimpsed a legend. At the coffee stand, seasoned officers muttered the tale, skeptical yet intrigued. One joked, "Maybe it was just Siri, upgraded." The quip drew laughter around the table, lifting some of the weight. Yet everyone knew, behind the laughter, lingered a truth too hard to dismiss. Someone had intervened, and no one knew why. Marcus Hale, the commander, could not accept that everything would simply be erased. He sought out Eleanor Brooks. The signal analysis room was unchanged, cold, lit by the weary hum of fluorescent lamps. On the desk lay the same old compass, its needle trembling faintly as if it were breathing. Eleanor sat behind the monitors, her eyes unblinking, hands clasped together. When Marcus entered, she did not look at him. She only set the compass on the table and said softly, "Sometimes, the only true direction is breaking the silence." No more words were needed. Marcus understood. And he understood too that within a system built to worship rules and procedures, people like Eleanor would always be relegated to the shadows. Yet he also knew this: without that one breach of protocol, his men would no longer be alive. In America, strength is celebrated muscle, medals, parades broadcast with soaring music. But this story revealed something different. Sometimes the chronicles of survival are written by the unseen, by those hidden behind cold screens, people we so easily overlook in the crowd. In the weeks that followed, the halls of Coronado echoed with a half-joking refrain, "If the radios go silent, wait for Ghost 11." The phrase became an inside legend. Someone even printed a tiny ghost decal and slapped it onto a field radio, a way of laughing to disguise a quiet gratitude. Eleanor remained the same. She sat at her old desk, turning the compass out of habit. Her co-workers still thought her eccentric, but some glances toward her had changed. Less indifference, more a flicker of respect, though unspoken. Marcus, in a closed meeting, once tried to bring up the unidentified signal source that had saved his men. But the response from higher command was only a shrug, followed by the caution, "Best to let this pass." He knew that was how the system worked. Sometimes, victories too unusual would be buried, because they didn't fit the framework. But outside, within the American military community, a small flame had been lit. The story of Ghost 11 needed no official report, no press conference. It lived in the memories of those who had been saved, and in the whispered retellings spreading through barracks across the country. A few weeks later, the Coronado briefing room seemed to wear a new face. The dark wooden walls were still there, the familiar heavy scent of coffee still lingered, and the rows of rigid chairs still lined up neatly, but on the main wall, something unfamiliar had appeared. Not a flag, not a gleaming medal, just an old compass, sealed in a glass case. Its metal edges were chipped, its glass scratched, but beneath it, a single line was carved with precision. Competence is the only measure. There was no ceremony, no official honor. The compass appeared quietly, just as the one who once turned its needle in the dark had always remained quiet. Yet anyone who walked into the room understood. This was no mere display. It was a symbol of a battle that had nearly consumed them, and of an unseen hand that had pulled them back to life. No one spoke the name Eleanor Brooks. There was no inscription, no photograph, but in their hearts, everyone knew. Especially Marcus Hale. Each time his eyes lifted toward that compass, he saw again the image of his team sprinting through the night, and heard that steady female voice echo, "Ghost 11, on your 6." Within the barracks, the story of Ghost 11 was no longer a secret. It became the whispers in hallways, the tales retold at dinner, even woven into exhausted banter during grueling workouts. A young soldier once laughed, saying he had stuck a ghost decal on his radio. Just in case it died, maybe she'd come back. The joke made the squad laugh, but in every eye there flickered respect. On veterans forums, the phrase, "the 11th ghost," began to surface. Debates followed. Was it a daring analyst, a figure in intelligence, or even a guardian angel of the SEALs? Some doubted, dismissing it as an embellished tale. Yet the more it was argued, the deeper it rooted. What gave it life was not accuracy, but belief. Eleanor remained at her old desk, in the glow of blue screens. She did not seek recognition, nor the glare of any spotlight. Now and then, a colleague passing by would pause at the compass on her desk. Once they had called her the Shadow. Now some offered a small smile, a nod, a silent greeting, a muted acknowledgement. Others joked lightly, "Don't let her stay quiet too long, or the whole base might lose signal." Even those half-jesting words, beneath their humor, were a rare admission of value from a culture not prone to sentiment. Marcus knew in his heart that the greatest truth was not whether someone's name was carved in stone. The truth was this: An invisible voice had saved them from death, and that truth would echo long after. He remembered the first time he stood before the compass on the wall, and thought, sometimes, no face is needed, just a hand that grips firmly at the moment it matters most. In America, where people are accustomed to bronze statues etched with the names of heroes, this story left another kind of lesson, that some choose to remain unseen, and it is they who write the chapters of survival. And sometimes, a brief voice in the dark can be stronger than the loudest shout in a crowd. The compass still turned, its needle still pointing north. Ghost 11 had no face, no metal, but now she was a symbol. And somewhere, across frequencies thought to be silent, perhaps that steady voice still lingers, a reminder that in the most perilous moment, sometimes the only thing we need to trust is the calm of a human being who knows exactly what must be done. And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe.